Section 15 of Gray's Anatomy Part 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.L. Cohen, Anatomy of the Human Body Part 4 by Henry Gray. The Fore-brain Part 3. Temporal lobe, lobus temporalis. The temporal lobe presents superior, lateral, and inferior surfaces. The superior surface forms the lower limit of the lateral fissure and overlaps the insula. On opening out the lateral fissure, 3 or 4 gyri will be seen springing from the depths of the hinder end of the fissure and running obliquely forward and outward on the posterior part of the upper surface of the superior temporal gyrus. These are named the transverse temporal gyri. Heschel. The lateral surface is bounded above by the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure and by the imaginary line continued backward from it. Below, it is limited by the inferior lateral border of the hemisphere. It is divided into superior, middle, and inferior gyri by the superior and middle temporal sulci. The superior temporal sulcus runs from before backwards across the temporal lobe and some little distance below, but parallel with the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure, and hence it is often termed the parallel sulcus. The middle temporal sulcus takes the same direction as the superior, but is situated at a lower level and is usually subdivided into 2 or more parts. The superior temporal gyrus lies between the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure and the superior temporal sulcus and is continuous behind with the supramarginal and angular gyri. The middle temporal gyrus is placed between the superior and middle temporal sulci and is joined posteriorly with the angular gyrus. The inferior temporal gyrus is placed below the middle temporal sulcus and is connected behind with the inferior occipital gyrus. It also extends around the inferior lateral border onto the inferior surface of the temporal lobe, where it is limited by the inferior sulcus. The inferior surface is concave and is continuous posteriorly with the tentorial surface of the occipital lobe. It is traversed by the inferior temporal sulcus, which extends from near the occipital pole behind to within a short distance of the temporal pole in front, but is frequently subdivided by bridging gyri. Lateral to this fissure is the narrow tentorial part of the inferior temporal gyrus, and medial to it the fusiform gyrus, which extends from the occipital to the temporal pole. This gyrus is limited medially by the collateral fissure, which separates it from the lingual gyrus behind and from the hippocampal gyrus in front. The insula, island of Ryle central lobe, lies deeply in the lateral or sivulant fissure, and can only be seen when the lips of that fissure are widely separated, since it is overlapped and hidden by the gyri which bound the fissure. These gyri are termed the opercula of the insula. They are separated from each other by the 3 rami of the lateral fissure, and are named the orbital frontal, frontotemporal, and temporal opercula. The orbital operculum lies below the anterior horizontal ramus of the fissure, the frontal between this and the anterior ascending ramus, the parietal between the anterior ascending ramus and the upturned end of the posterior ramus, and the temporal below the posterior ramus. The frontal operculum is of small size in those cases where the anterior horizontal and ascending rami of the lateral fissures arise from a common stem. The insula is surrounded by a deep circular sulcus, which separates it from the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. When the opercula have been removed, the insula is seen as a triangular eminence, the apex of which is directed toward the anterior perforated substance. It is divided into a larger anterior and a smaller posterior part by a deep sulcus, which runs backward and upward from the apex of the insula. The anterior part is subdivided by a shallow sulci into 3 or 4 short gyri, while the posterior part is formed by 1 long gyrus, which is often bifurcated at its upper end. The cortical gray substance of the insula is continuous with that of the different opercula, while its deep surface corresponds with the lentiform nucleus of the corpus striatum. Limbic lobe. The term limbic lobe was introduced by Broca, and under it he included the cingulate and hippocampal gyri, which together arch around the corpus callosum in the hippocampal fissure. These he separated on the morphological ground that they are well developed in animals possessing a keen sense of smell, osmotic animals, such as the dog and the fox. They were thus regarded as part of the rhinencephalon, but it is now recognized that they belong to the neopallium. The cingulate gyrus is therefore sometimes described as part of the frontal lobe, and the hippocampal as part of the temporal lobe. The cingulate gyrus, gyrus cinguli, callosal convolution, is an arch-shaped convolution lying in close relation to the superior surface of the corpus callosum, from which it is separated by a slit-like fissure, the callosal fissure. It commences below the rostrum of the corpus callosum, curves around in front of the genu, extends along the upper surface of the body, and finally turns downward behind the splenium, where it is connected by a narrow isthmus with the hippocampal gyrus. It is separated from the medial part of the superior frontal gyrus by the cingulate sulcus, and from the precuneus by the subparietal sulcus. The hippocampal gyrus, gyrus hippocampi, is bounded above by the hippocampal fissure and below by the anterior part of the collateral fissure. Behind, it is continuous superiorly through the isthmus with the cingulate gyri and inferiorly with the lingual gyrus. Running in the substance of the cingulate and hippocampal gyri and connecting them together is a tract of arched fibers named the cingulum. The anterior extremity of the hippocampal gyrus is recurved in the form of a hook, uncus, which is separated from the apex of the temporal lobe by a slight fissure, the incisura temporalis. Although superficially continuous with the hippocampal gyrus, the uncus forms morphologically a part of the rhinencephalon. The hippocampal fissure, fissura hippocampi, dentate fissure, begins immediately behind the splenium of the corpus callosum and runs forward between the hippocampal and dentate gyri to end in the uncus. It is a complete fissure and gives rise to the prominence of the hippocampus in the inferior cornu of the lateral ventricle. Rhinencephalon. The rhinencephalon comprises the olfactory lobe, the uncus, the subcallosal and supracallosal gyri, the fascia dentata hippocampus, the septum pellucidum, the fornix, and the hippocampus. 1. The olfactory lobe, lobus olfactorius, is situated under the inferior or orbital surface of the frontal lobe. In many vertebrates, it constitutes a well-marked portion of the hemisphere and contains an extension of the lateral ventricle. But in man, and some other mammals, it is rudimentary. It consists of the olfactory bulb and tract, the olfactory trigone, the para-olfactory area of Broca, and the anterior perforated substance. A. The olfactory bulb, bulbus olfactorius, is an oval reddish-gray mass which rests on the cribriform plate of the ethmoid and forms the anterior expanded extremity of the olfactory tract. Its undersurface receives the olfactory nerves which pass upward through the cribriform plate from the olfactory region of the nasal cavity. Its minute structure is described later. B. The olfactory tract, tractus olfactorius, is a narrow white band triangular on coronal section, the apex being directed upward. It lies in the olfactory sulcus on the inferior surface of the frontal lobe and divides posteriorly into two striae, a medial and a lateral. The lateral stria is directed across the lateral part of the anterior perforated substance and then bends abruptly medialward towards the uncus of the hippocampal gyrus. The medial stria turns medialward behind the para-olfactory area and ends in the subcallosal gyrus. In some cases, a small intermediate stria is seen running backward to the anterior perforated substance. C. The olfactory trigone, Trigonum olfactorium, is a small triangular area in front of the anterior perforated substance. Its apex, directed forward, occupies the posterior part of the olfactory sulcus and is brought into view by throwing back the olfactory tract. D. The para-olfactory area of Broca, Area para-olfactoria, is a small triangular field on the medial surface of the hemisphere in front of the subcallosal gyrus, from which it is separated by the posterior para-olfactory sulcus. It is continuous below with the olfactory trigone and above and in front with the cingulate gyrus. It is limited anteriorly by the anterior para-olfactory sulcus. E. The anterior perforated substance, substantia perforata anterior, is an irregularly quadrilateral area in front of the optic tract and behind the olfactory trigone, from which it is separated by the fissura primea. Medially and in front, it is continuous with the subcallosal gyrus. Laterally, it is bounded by the lateral stria of the olfactory tract and is continued into the uncus. Its gray substance is confluent above with that of the corpus striatum and is perforated anteriorly by numerous small blood vessels. 2. The uncus has already been described as the recurved, hook-like portion of the hippocampal gyrus. 3. The subcallosal, supracallosal, and dentate gyri form a rudimentary